This is the second test review for Philosophy 110P. And so let's begin by talking about John Hick and the problem of evil. John Hick, as you know, created a religious explanation of evil called a theodicy, Theodicy. And in this theodicy, he says that we need to make mistakes and to suffer and have adversity for moral and spiritual development. So as it asks on this review sheet, what is the degree to which Hick thinks our suffering is due to the misuse of free will? The short answer is he thinks that most of human suffering is due to people's free choices and the effect of those choices on themselves and on others. Some of our suffering is due to malicious choices, others to negligent choices, still others to seeking immediate pleasure while ignoring long-term consequences, is when people habitually overeat. So the short answer is Hick thinks that most of our suffering is due to someone's misusing his or her free will. Does Hick believe that all evil is punishment or therapy? Well, and this connects to the idea of whether all suffering is either punitive or therapeutic. And the answer is no. Hick doesn't think that all suffering will involve punishing people who make evil choices, or that all suffering is immediately therapeutic. In other words, that people who suffer will immediately get better in some way. He doesn't believe that either. He thinks that sometimes innocent people, including babies and young children, can suffer through no fault of their own. So he does think there are consequences to our actions, and that much of our suffering is due to someone's misusing his or her free will. But he doesn't think that all of evil is punitive or therapeutic. He doesn't think that all suffering is punitive or therapeutic. What does Hick mean by soul making? Well, by soul making, Hick means moral and spiritual development. And that's what he believes. He believes we are here for moral and spiritual development, so that eventually all of us can be sufficiently refined to enter heaven. Now, the other question, why does Hick think the development of virtues requires adversity and evil? Well, Hick believes, and this I think makes some sense, that you can't have the virtues without various related evils. For example, we can't have courage without danger. We can't have charity unless there's need or poverty, right? We can't have sympathy unless there's misfortune. Okay, we can't have forgiveness unless there's something to forgive or some sort of evil or wrongdoing. So his position is that for us to develop morally and spiritually, we need negative things, we need adversity, we need evils. Okay, next. Does Hick believe that evil is unreal? One of the first things that Hick does in his the essay we have on the problem of evil is to say that he rejects from the beginning certain attempts to explain evil. And one attempt that some religious people have used to explain evil is to say that in some sense evil is just a mere shadow, or it's illusory, that it really doesn't exist in any positive way. Well, Hick dismisses that. He thinks that evil is quite real. He says it's acknowledged to be real in various forms of ethical monotheism, as in the religious scriptures of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And he thinks that the suffering caused by evil is quite real. So he does believe that evil is real. Okay, now you also need to know the following. You need to know that, of course, Hick believes that God exists, right? Because, I mean, a theodicy is an attempt to explain how God and evil can coexist, how it's not irrational to acknowledge on some level evil and also believe in God. So he certainly believes in God, and he certainly believes in an afterlife, as in heaven. And it's possible that he also believes that we'll have other opportunities after we die for further moral and spiritual development, because he does seem to think that ultimately everyone will achieve moral and spiritual development, and for many people one lifetime isn't enough, as when babies or very young children die. Okay, now also, why does Hick believe that at times another life is needed as for babies who die at birth? Well, in a sense, this is partly self-answering. It's precisely because people can enter the world and leave it without complete moral and spiritual development, including babies who die at or near birth, that he says that if we're going to have complete moral and spiritual development, we need to have additional opportunities, other lifetimes. Okay, now, and by the way, Hick looks at God as a kind of a perfect parent who wants what is best for God's children. And what's best for God's children, for us human beings, is for us to have complete moral and spiritual development and to be with God in heaven after we've accomplished that development. And then there are questions about the problem of evil in general. Why would the deaths of babies and the existence of animal, in other words, non-human animal suffering, be especially problematic for the soul-making view of Hick? Okay, well, again, the deaths of babies, let's say, is something that you would think you would not expect to happen in a world in which where the main purpose for people is to achieve moral and spiritual development. Because, I mean, especially the deaths of possibly billions of babies, there have been estimates that possibly as many as one half of the people who have ever lived have died, let's say, by the age of 2. And that's tens of billions of people. And so you normally wouldn't expect that if the chief purpose for our being here is moral and spiritual development. So that does, I'm not saying Hick can't answer it, but it does constitute something of a challenge for Hick. Of course, Hick's way of answering it is to talk about the role of faith, and then to talk about the possibility of other experiences and other opportunities that people have after one lifetime, as in reincarnation or possibly other worlds. Okay, now the other thing that I mentioned is the existence of animal suffering, non-human animal suffering. Now, Hick really doesn't in this essay talk about this, but non-human animal suffering normally would be considered a form of natural or physical evil. And normally we even have laws against deliberately inflicting cruelty on our pets, let's say. But in any event, so other things being equal, people would normally say that non-human animal suffering is an evil of a kind. And presumably Hick's not going to try to explain most of that suffering in the way that he tried to explain human suffering, right? Because remember, for Hick, human suffering occurs because of people's choices, and it is needed for us to develop morally and spiritually. So we suffer and we realize we make a mistake, or someone else suffers and then we respond sympathetically. And so suffering can have an essential role in our moral and spiritual development. But a lot of non-human animal suffering presumably is not going to function the same way, because for one thing, Hick doesn't believe that non-human animals have free will, and he doesn't believe they're here for moral and spiritual development. And as far as getting us to respond sympathetically, let me put it this way: a lot of non-human animal suffering occurs outside of human beings and human control. A lot of it is in the wild, and it's not a matter of people regularly responding to a lot of the human suffering. Now, some of it we do, as in the case of pets or dogs and cats. That's true. But a whole lot of wild animal suffering is something over which people have very little control, and so then the question is, why does it exist? Well, that's a tough question. It's a tough question, and I'm just saying it's a challenge, Rick. I'm not saying he couldn't answer it, but however he answers it, he's not going to answer it in the same way that he explains human suffering, because again, he doesn't believe that non-human animals have free will. Okay, let's look at the next one. Again, what is a theodicy? Theodicy. Well, it's a religious explanation of evil to try to show how God and evil can coexist, to try to show that it can be rational to believe in God and still acknowledge the existence of evil. Now I want to talk about McCloskey on evil. So John Hick and McCloskey are contrasting thinkers, right? Hick is a person who is religious, trying to explain how evil may have an essential role in God's plan, and an essential role in our moral and spiritual development. And then McCloskey is what you might call a secular philosopher who thinks that there's so much evil that it is unlikely that all of it is essential, to some higher justifying purpose. So McCloskey, the question is, does McCloskey think that a perfect God exists? And the short answer is no. McCloskey thinks, again, there's so much evil that it is unlikely that there is a perfect God, because he thinks there's so much evil that a perfect God wouldn't allow this much evil to exist. Okay, now, the other thing is, I want to talk about God and good, and particularly the divine command theory. The divine command theory, you say this is an expression, the divine command theory is an expression that is supposed to fit a group of interrelated theories, holding that in some sense God is the ultimate authority on right and wrong, and not only that, but that all standards of right and wrong in some sense emanate from God, and that something is right because God commands it, or something is wrong because God prohibits it. Okay, now what is Kai Nielsen going to say about this? Okay, well, Kai Nielsen wasn't religious, or isn't religious. Kai Nielsen believes that we can understand what is right and what is wrong, and to make moral distinctions without being religious, without believing in God. He thinks we can determine whether some practice is likely to help us get along with one another, whether some practice is likely to help us reduce or prevent social conflict, and then we can judge the practice on those standards. Okay, so here's what you need to know about Nielsen and the divine command theory. Nielsen believes that believers in the God of ethical monotheism, and especially Jewish believers, Christian believers, and Muslim believers, must believe in moral goodness. Now, why is that? Well, because to the extent that they believe in the God of those religions, that God is supposed to be by definition good. Because if you believe in puppies, you're going to believe in young animals. If you believe in triangles, you're going to believe in three-sided figures. Right? So what he's saying is, yes, there are all sorts of connections between various forms of religion and morality. And those people who are believers in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which we can call ethical monotheism, those believers are going to necessarily believe in goodness, moral goodness. But, and this is a key distinction, but he says people can believe in moral goodness. People can believe, for example, that honesty is morally good without necessarily believing in God. So he wants to say that morality doesn't require morality doesn't require a religious basis. Morality doesn't require a belief in a personal God or a belief in religion. And that's one of his main conclusions. And so I want you to know that that's his position. Again, the question is, does Nielsen think that morality can be defined without reference to God? The answer is to be yes. He believes we all have an interest in getting along with one another and reducing and preventing social conflict and suffering. And he says morality should be able, if it's at all rational, to help us do that. Now I want to talk about political philosophy and especially libertarianism. Does libertarianism imply free economic markets? Okay. Because libertarianism is political philosophy saying that all ordinary adults should be free to do what they want, provided that they're not violating other people's rights to life, liberty, or property. Okay? So it calls for freedom and personal responsibility, but it also says that you need to respect other people's space, other people's rights. So does it imply free economic markets? Yes. Libertarians believe that the government should minimize its control of its ordinary adult citizens. Now, someone might ask, does that mean libertarians are anarchists, that they believe in no law? No. Libertarians are what are called, they believe in minarchy. In other words, they believe in minimal government. They believe that we need government to protect rights to life, liberty, and property. So they believe in traffic laws. They believe laws against murder, laws against fraud, laws against assault and battery. Right? They believe in having the criminal courts, the civil courts. They believe in having a military to protect us from foreign aggression. Okay, so libertarians do believe in laws. They're not anarchists, but they believe in minimal government, and they believe that the government should have a minimal role in the economy. Okay, so yes, it does imply a belief in free economic markets. So that's true. Of course, it goes beyond that and calls for freedom in other areas of our lives as well. Is libertarianism concerned with disparities in wealth? Not as such. Libertarians don't automatically oppose all disparities in wealth unless someone acquired the wealth illegitimately, as through violence or fraud. Libertarians have no objection, say, to Oprah Winfrey's having more wealth than most other people. Okay, so libertarians, the key thing for libertarians is how do people acquire what they acquired. Okay, now, does libertarianism approve of the forced redistribution of wealth, as in helping out industries? No. Libertarians don't approve of the forced redistribution of wealth, as in helping out industries, let's say with subsidies. Libertarians support minimal government, as I've indicated before, especially a court system, police, and the military. But they don't think the government should be heavily involved in the economy when it comes to regulations, when it comes to income redistribution, minimum wage laws, rent control, and so on. Okay, is libertarianism a position that's neither more nor less than free market economics? Well, libertarianism includes free market economics, but it goes beyond that, as I've suggested earlier. Libertarians say people should be free not only in the marketplace, but also free elsewhere, as in the bedroom, or in the public square, as when expressing free speech. In short, libertarians support economic freedom, but also freedom of other sorts as well. And think of the freedoms expressed by the Bill of Rights, for example. Now, as to socialism, whether socialists are concerned with economic disparities, yes. And from Carl Cohen's reading, you can tell that Carl Cohen was very much concerned to reduce differences in wealth and income. Now, why didn't Carl Cohen believe that economic planning involves coercion? Cohen believed that so long as adults vote on how to manage the economy, that such planning doesn't involve force or coercion. Okay, so Carl Cohen says let's usher in socialism democratically, and so long as people can vote on the economic managers and vote on economic plans, he says that doesn't involve force or coercion. You also need to know the fact that Cohen sees socialism as the completion of democracy, or applying democratic principles to the world of economy and work. And he says that within the first 2 pages. So you need to know Again, that for Cohen, socialism is the completion of democracy. Now, we also need to know about punishment. Now, what do you need to know about punishment? Well, you need to know, for example, that we have two main authors when it comes to punishment. We have Carl Cohen, okay, who in 1968 published a book, The Crime of Punishment, in which he criticized the theory of retribution, or the retributivist theory, and in which he defended the view that criminal justice system should be aimed principally at reformation and secondly at deterrence, but not at all on retribution or giving people what they deserve. Okay, that's Menninger. Menninger was a prominent psychiatrist. Carl Menninger believed that most habitual criminals have psychological and psychiatric problems, and they need to be addressed by professionals and especially psychiatrists. So the question, whether Carl Menninger believes that most criminals can be reformed, yes, if we devoted enough energy and resources to that for that purpose. Does he believe that most criminals have psychological problems? Yes. Does Menninger believe that most criminals need therapy? Yes. Does Menninger believe that criminals deserve to be treated more humanely, or harshly rather? No. In fact, he thinks they're often treated too harshly, with a view to making them pay for their crimes, which is a retributivist idea. And he thinks instead we need to focus on reforming criminals, and we should have a therapeutic team, and that could consist of like psychiatrists, possibly psychologists, licensed clinical social workers, friends and family, and that it could require giving people more education, giving people possibly various medicines, giving people psychotherapy. But anyway, he believed that what we need to focus on in the criminal justice system is not traditional punishment in the sense of retribution, but especially reformation. Okay, so I want you to know that. Now, you also need to know whether Menninger believes that we secretly envy criminals. Yes. Does he believe that we tend to identify with them? Yes. Does he believe that we regard them as scapegoats? Yes. As a matter of fact, Menninger said that very often people identify with criminals, they even admire certain criminals, such as clever bank robbers. I mean, just also think of the way in which, like in the 19th century, how Frank and Jesse James were kind of looked up to by some people and romanticized. And the same thing with Bonnie and Clyde in the 20th century, and John Dillinger. That these people, and then not only that, but think of all the novels and movies about the mafia. So he says that on the one hand, people seem to be fascinated by certain criminals and certain crime, and on the other hand, they condemn crime, and they in a sense get some pleasure from punishing people. And he says the reason there's so much pleasure in punishing people is that most people harbor criminal desires, even if they don't act on them. And by punishing the criminals, it relieves people from their sense of guilt. In other words, people, by going for harsh punishments, the law-abiding citizens who have criminal desires feel as if they've been cleansed or purged. And that's what he means by saying that criminals are scapegoats. Okay, now what does C.S. Lewis regard as the central purpose of punishment? The central purpose of punishment for Lewis is retribution. What is retribution? The retributivist says that criminals should be punished because and to the extent that they deserve it. The retributivist says that when someone commits a crime, that normally the person has chosen to violate certain norms that most people accept, and the person is trying to derive an unjustified benefit. In other words, trying to profit from violating norms that most people accept. And so by doing that, the criminal has upset the moral balance and has created a debt to society. Remember when people say they've served their time and therefore they've paid their debt to society? That's retributivist thinking. The view that the punishment should fit the crime, that's retributivist thinking. The view should only punish the guilty, that's part of retributivism as well. Okay? So anyway, so Lewis was defending retributivism, and Lewis believed that the humanitarian/therapeutic theory is inhumane and unjust because he says it doesn't treat individuals as really responsible for their actions, but treats them as almost like non-human animals or little children, or and doesn't treat them as responsible. And it says that that society has the right through psychiatrists to manipulate people into conformity without regard to their rights and without regard to what they deserve based on their actions. So C.S. Lewis believed that the humanitarian/therapeutic theory tends to reduce criminals to objects of social and psychiatric manipulation, rather than holding them accountable for what they've done and then treating them accordingly. Okay, now the other thing, according to Lewis, the humanitarian therapeutic theory is just about reforming criminals and to some extent discouraging crime, but according to Lewis, the theory isn't about just punishment, since it never asks what criminals deserve based on their crime. Okay, so he says punishment can be just only if it's deserved, right? But he says that the people who believe in the humanitarian/therapeutic theory don't ask what people deserve based on their choices. It says, what can we do to change their behavior, to reform them, or to treat them in such a way as to discourage other people from committing the same crime. So he's saying it's not about really punishment. It's certainly not about just punishment, because just punishment requires giving people what they deserve, and that's a question that doesn't even get asked within the context of the humanitarian or therapeutic theory. By the way, it turns out that C.S. Lewis calls the theory humanitarian theory, and as he's criticizing it. And it turns out that when he's defending the theory, that is Menninger is defending the theory, Menninger defended the theory, he calls it therapeutic theory. So that's why I call it the humanitarian/therapeutic theory. Now, what does Menninger believe that punishment should be aimed at? Well, principally reformation, that is reforming, transforming the criminal into a law-abiding, productive citizen. And then secondly, deterring crime. But principally reformation. Menninger thinks that the primary role of the criminal justice system is reformation and to some degree deterrence of crime. You need to know that Lewis believes that punishment should fit the crime, which just follows very directly from the retributivist theory. Remember, the retributivist theory says that you should punish only the guilty, you should punish them because they're guilty, and you should punish them in accordance with the nature and seriousness of their crime. And then, so yes, it's true that Lewis believed that punishment should in fact fit the crime. Okay, and that's pretty much what you'll need to know for your second test. And the second test will consist of questions such as true, false, and multiple choice. So there'll be 20 questions. 20 questions. They'll be objective. There'll be no essays. The questions will be based on this review sheet. So I'm hoping that you'll not only read the review sheet, but you'll also repeatedly look at this review and stopping it where you want or replaying it where you like. And that concludes, again, this review for the second test for Philosophy 110.